Okay, so here we are again. Yes, but now I've swapped the webcam for the GoPro Hero 5 Black Edition. Yes, I have. So here we are in 2.7K. Glorious. What? Yes, you poor unfortunate people. Yes, fancy having to look at this. Well, there you go. Right, so following on from the video I put on my open YouTube channel the other day about, well, I had a bit of a ramble and a bit of ISO noise processing. That shot was done at 2000 ISO. This shot, if we flip over to here, this shot is at 16,000 ISO. That's quite drastic, isn't it? And by the way, Neil, because I'm doing this because of something Neil said. He said, do something at super high ISO. Neil, I've only eaten one packet of Smills. There's this one left and there's another one down there. Yes, unopened. So it's taken me 2 days to eat one packet of Smills. Aren't I a good boy? Just forgive me a minute while I have a short slurp. I love my tea. Oh, magic. Right, so this particular shot is, as we say, 16,000 ISO. Now, before we get into processing this, I just want to explain one or two things about this shot. This is what Lightroom does to the shot when it imports it. This is what Lightroom, or how Lightroom initially renders it. And you can see the histogram is way over to the right. Now, I'm going to first of all look at this image in Canon's DPP. And so here's the image, and you can still see it's quite bright, and it's showing us we've got some highlight clipping along the back of the muskox here. Now, what we want to just concentrate on for a moment is the actual EXIF data. Now, this is the internal EXIF data off this Canon 1DX Mark II, and as you can see, we're in manual exposure, 1/2500th of a second f7.1 because we're handheld, and we are at 560mm on the 200-400, so we've got the extender in at 400mm, which stretches it out to 560. Now, if we come up to here, metering mode, you'll see I'm in partial metering. Now, let me just explain this, and you just bear with me. If we were in evaluative metering, we will be taking an average meter reading of various zones around this general scene. And so we will be taking into account a lot of this very, very light background. And this muskox it's not backlit because it's quite cloudy. But at the end of the day, we have got a relatively dark subject against a relatively light, bright background and foreground. So if we were to use matrix metering, this shot will be underexposed because there is far more brightness in the scene under the footprint of the evaluative metering mode than there is in partial metering. Now, what's the difference between partial metering, Andy, and center weighted metering? Center weighted metering is not something that I ever use. Usually I use evaluative, but if I get in a situation like this, I go to partial. I don't go to center weighted. Center weighted looks at the center, what will it be? I forget how much it is. It's roughly about the same size area as partial metering. But the thing is, it also takes into account the evaluative metering as well. So it's a little bit like using partial with evaluative that's based around the active autofocus point, because the meter takes its cue from the autofocus point. Now, the result for me, usually on Canon cameras, when I use centre weighted, it usually comes out, when I get in a scenario like this, it usually comes out a tad darker, maybe a third, maybe half a stop darker, than if I go into partial metering, which works as most people would imagine centre weighted does. All we're looking at is the centre circle of this image, which is basically, I always imagine that if we were to put the actual circle for the partial metering, it would, 90% of it would be full of the head and the lower part of the, can I call it, a mane of this muskox. So I use either evaluative or I go into partial, because I just find it ignores the background more, because if I figure this background into the exposure, or I allow the camera to figure any part of this background into the exposure will be dark, therefore the image will be underexposed. Now, we can all see that this image looks better than the Lightroom rendition, because this has got too much contrast in it, whereas the DPP version of the image hadn't got any excess contrast in it. But from an exposure point of view, it looks pretty much the same. But if I go and open this image in raw therapy, now you can see what the raw file actually looks like without any adjustments put on it. So DPP does actually put some adjustments automatically in the background onto your images. So as you can see, this image is underexposed, and as normal, as I would expect, most images that look slightly overexposed on the camera, in Lightroom and in the likes of DPP if we're on a Canon camera, or in View NX if we're on a Nikon camera, when you open them in raw therapy, they always appear to be a little bit underexposed. Now, the thing you've got to concern yourself about is the fact that this was shot at 16,000 ISO. So at 16,000 ISO, the dynamic range of this 1DX Mark II is crippled, totally crippled. We will assume, for the sake of argument, that it's got a 10 stop dynamic range at base ISO, 10, 11 stops. I don't know what the quoted figure is, and I've never tried to work it out myself. But if we say it's 10 stops at base ISO, you'll be lucky if it's more than about 7 stops at 16,000 ISO, probably even less than 7. But the thing is, if we contemplate this histogram here, all digital cameras, their dynamic range is greater from the midtones to their base shadows than it is from the midtones to their top highlights. It's always shorter in the midtone to highlight range than it is in the midtone to shadow range. So if we clip a stop or 2 stops of dynamic range off the camera's base ISO dynamic range when we shoot at 16,000 ISO, then you can safely say that you've lost more in your highlights than you have in your shadows. And so if we try and expose to the right, which is what we were doing here, if we go back to Lightroom, if we try and expose to the right too much, what we keep as highlight detail at base ISO, we will completely and utterly blow at ISOs up at 16,000. We will completely lose them. They will be unrecoverable. So again, this is why I always favour, when I'm shooting high ISO, when I'm shooting a subject like this, I always favour going into partial metering, because it helps to meter, in this case, the darker tones of the head of this muskox, but it doesn't underexpose too much, because it doesn't see too much of this brighter background and foreground. So that's just a little bit of a tip for you. That's the way I work, especially if I'm shooting high ISO with a big long telephoto lens, in this case 400mm with a 1.4 converter, so that's 560mm. I would, in a scenario like this, which is a bit similar to being backlit, I would drop my exposure metering mode on a Canon camera from evaluative to partial. If I'm on a Nikon camera, I just usually use matrix and keep it in matrix, but then I will add a little bit of positive exposure compensation. So there you go. But anyway, let's concentrate on this image. Let's take it over into the develop module. And Neil, I think this should qualify as super high ISO at 16,000, and you can see this is what Lightroom is doing to the image, and it looks horrible, overly contrasty. The highlights look as if they are blown, and if you look at the histogram, we are getting a white highlight clipping indicator. That means that as far as Lightroom's concerned, this image is clipped in all three main primary colour channels, red, green and blue. That is cobblers. Let's go over to my process version swap and just apply it, and now you can see that we've got a boatload of headroom. Well, it's not really a boatload. We've got highlights running virtually to the right hand end of the histogram, but we haven't got any blown highlights. So, you know, I mean, it is what it is. So we've actually reduced, I won't say we've reduced the noise, but we've reduced the perceivable visual effect of the noise by just bringing the exposure down by one stop, the contrast by -33. We've pushed the blacks up by 25. I'm actually going to just try something a little bit different, and I'll just take them up to +6. What are we going to do next? Well, if we go and look at the tone curve, automatically the tone curve, as because we've done this process version swap, the tone curve has automatically converted itself into this rather subtle inverted S-shaped curve, which is fine. And what else? Detail. We've got the default sharpening on, no masking, no noise reduction. So the first thing I'm going to do is hold down the Alt key and lift the masking until I'm just starting to see a definitive blackness going on in this background. So we've actually put 26 masking on the sharpening recipe. We're then going to apply a little bit of noise reduction, probably only about 7 or 8. We'll leave it at 6. And for a 16,000 ISO image, that is not looking too bad at all. And to be quite honest with you, getting the contrast under control, getting the exposure right, bringing it into an acceptable, what can I say, an acceptable level of brightness and tonality, we can see that just by riding that initial exposure slightly to the right by switching from evaluative, because evaluative would have made the image too dark in the first place, much darker than this, but it will still have had the noise. So we've actually circumvented the noise a bit by knocking a stop of exposure out. That is why exposing to the right is really always invariably the best policy, unless you're photographing polar bears in the snow, and really and truly you still want to be exposing to the right even when you do that, but probably not as much as if you were photographing the black cat in the coal house at midnight. But you know, exposing to the right there is just no negative point to it. There's no downside to exposing to the right, and your camera's meter is always trying to underexpose to guard against blowing highlights anyway. So this is why when I do landscape photography, I don't use my camera's light meter. I use an external handheld meter, because it's far more precise, and then the camera does exactly as I tell it to do. So basically, if I screw the exposure up on a landscape picture, I've only got myself to blame. Yes. So anyway, there we go. If we go and look at this image as a before and after, and we'll take it up to a fit to screen view, you can see we've got the overall effect of the noise is less apparent. We're not going to take this image into Photoshop. We're not going to apply any third-party noise reduction, because I can tell you now, the images I've processed it here is up on all my microstock websites. It sells, and it sells well, and I've probably sold 8, 9 A3 and A3 plus prints of this, and one A2, and when you print it out, the noise doesn't show. It shows a little tiny bit on an A2 print, but it's about 10% as obvious as it is in this digital rendition of the image that I can see on my monitor, and you might not be able to see it quite so well because of video compression. But I can assure you, when you print it out, because you're printing it out at such a high dot count per centimetre or per inch, this noise just sort of melts away into nothingness. So, you know, sort of harping back to the guy I was telling you about before, who never drove this camera and this lens above 400 ISO, it just seems a little bit on the ridiculous side, doesn't it? So there you go, one acceptable image. It is noisy. What on earth do you expect for 16,000 ISO? But 16,000 ISO is not quite as it's not quite as fatal as you might have thought. Anyway, and I've just noticed that I keep shaking the bloody camera every time I knock my arm, so I'm going to have to sort something out as an external mount for this camera. But anyway, there we go. Hope you found that useful, guys, and I'll see you again soon. Tooroo.